you to the co-chairs, and I would also very happy here to welcome all of you to this summer study. It's a pleasure for me and all of us to see so many. I think we have almost 450 people registered for this summer study, the highest number ever. And I think we will have a good week with a lot of interesting presentations, a lot of good discussions, and today the first good plenary. Before we go to the plenary, I would also like to thank the sponsors and the contributors. I think the list will maybe come here quite soon. Without their support, we will not be able to do this summer study for the reasonable fees which we take. Maybe some of you think that the fees are not reasonable, but I think for a full week with a hotel, food, a conference, all things, it is a quite low fee. And without the strong support from our sponsors, that will not be possible to do that. So can we give them applause? Okay, and then we'll go to today's plenary, and it's about EU's energy efficiency policies, the 2020 perspective and beyond. We all know that EU set an energy efficiency target or energy saving target in 2007. It was not a binding target. We also know that EU for a long time was not on track to meet that. By agreeing on the energy efficiency directive in 2012, we get a step forward, but there's still a way to go. But we also know that 2020 is only the first step. We have to look beyond 2020, and there is actually these days going a discussion what should be the EU climate and energy framework for 2030. There is a green paper out for consultation, and there's a long discussion, should we have a binding energy efficiency target combination with renewable energy and greenhouse gas target for 2030. So that's some of the topics which we will try to cover today for this plenary. And we have, I would say, 3 speakers. First, we have Fiona Hall, from the member of European Parliament from the Liberals. And she has been working with energy efficiency for a very long time. We're very happy to have you here. After she has been speaking for quarter an hour to 20 minutes, then Claudia Canevari from the Commission. She is Deputy Head of Unit for the Energy Efficiency Unit in the Commission, and so she will speak on behalf of the European Commission. And finally, we have 2 representatives chairing a presentation from the NGOs. It's Brook from Friends of Earth Europe, and Erika Hope from European Climate Foundation. So I think we will, by that, have a very good plenary, and if all of them stick to the maximum of 20 minutes, we will also have time for questions and discussions. So I'll really ask you to do that. By this, I will ask Fiona, and I think we will ask the plenary speakers to sit down there for the presentations, then you have to be able to see the others, and afterwards they will come up here. Fiona, please.
Good evening. It's lovely to be here. This is my 3rd time at the eceee Summer School, and I have to say that the other 2 times were really annoying. And that's because I came for just 1 day, and it was so frustrating because I could see that there was all this fascinating discussion going on in a lovely location with the sun shining and good food, and I just wanted to stay, but I couldn't. So this time, I'm here for the full week. You know, because for anyone who cares about energy efficiency, this is the most important place to be. You can't do energy efficiency in theory. It's all about what you actually do in practice. And that's what this week is about. But I want to spend a moment taking stock. Where are politicians going on energy efficiency at the moment? Is it all going horribly wrong? When I first came to the eceee Summer School in 2007, the big story was the 2020 package with its 3 targets: 20% greenhouse gas savings, 20% renewables, and 20% energy efficiency by 2020. In that summer of 2007, energy efficiency really felt like it was going places. Of course, we thought the 20% target should be a binding target like the other 2, but the overall mood was positive. What I actually remember is a fierce argument about how this 20% should be measured, bottom up or top down. I'm sure we'll have lots more such arguments this week. Unfortunately, that optimism that there was in 2007 wasn't something that the politicians really delivered on. And for a start, as we know, the efficiency targets stayed non-binding. Of course, there have been some big steps forward since then, such as getting rid of the 1,000 metres squared threshold for the major renovation of buildings and bringing in nearly zero energy new buildings, although I know there's an awful lot of debate about what that really means. Product standards have been quietly driving major savings. And on the transport side, motor manufacturers had found that despite their dire predictions that they couldn't possibly make major improvements to the efficiency of cars and vans, they have actually managed to do so. But from where I sit in the European Parliament, it has at times felt like a grueling process. First, the struggle to get a majority in the Parliament for an ambitious approach on energy efficiency, and then fighting to salvage as much of that ambition as possible in the teeth of relentless opposition from the member states. The Energy Efficiency Directive last year was a case in point. It was necessary because the EU was not on track to reach the 20% target, predictably because of the target not being binding. But energy ministers fought tooth and nail to introduce loopholes so that in the end, the EED doesn't entirely bridge the gap. I'm afraid, really afraid, that the political context is one of increasing reluctance to make ambitious commitments on energy efficiency. Like it or not, and I don't like it at all, this is where we find ourselves today, as the debate shifts towards 2030 and the new climate goals which need to be set. The big discussion is about whether we should just have a greenhouse gas target or a renewables one as well. With the ink barely dry on the 2012 Energy Efficiency Directive, there are very few voices indeed arguing the case for a 2030 energy efficiency target. This analysis sounds very gloomy, but it doesn't tell the whole story in terms of where politicians are going. Climate change has undoubtedly slipped down the political agenda compared to 6 years ago, despite mounting evidence that the effects are happening faster than predicted. Instead, the economic crisis is now the major preoccupation in all countries and with all political parties. But that doesn't have to be a threat. In fact, it's an opportunity. It's a good thing that member states now have to report on energy efficiency as part of their economic semester reporting. In fact, an important economic semester report has just been published. In this report, the Commission points out very clearly how energy efficiency equates to economic efficiency. This is what the report says. I'll read the exact words. Energy and climate change policies yield many macroeconomic benefits and contribute to smart and sustainable growth. By increasing energy efficiency, supporting research, and developing and commercializing innovative green technologies, member states can also boost their competitiveness and create jobs. And a few sentences later, reducing energy dependency and spending on energy imports will also have a positive effect on the current account balance. In 2011, net imports of fuel to the EU amounted to €388 billion, more than 3% of EU GDP. Investment in energy efficiency will not only reduce energy consumption costs, but also the social costs related to pollution caused by fossil fuels, such as health expenditures. So, we have it in a few sentences. Energy efficiency boosts green growth and competitiveness, it creates jobs, it improves energy security, and it helps the current account balance. It even cuts the nation's health bill. In other words, energy efficiency is not just a matter for climate idealists. It should be top of the to-do list for the hard-nosed economists who hold the purse strings in the treasuries of our member states. If you aren't serious about energy efficiency, then you're not to be trusted on the economy. That's got to be the message. So it seems to me that the most important battle ahead will not be at a European level, but nationally and locally. We need naming and shaming, shock and outrage whenever national, regional and local authorities are wasting money because they're failing to take energy efficiency seriously. The message is simple. If you're not delivering on energy efficiency, then you're economically incompetent. But it's not easy to change the mindset of politicians, and it certainly can't be done overnight. They will cover their ears and claim that making energy savings is just too difficult. There will need to be plenty of exchange about best practice from other countries. And I fear we will also need massive, unremitting, remorseless nagging. And here are a few places where the nagging should start. First, national plans to 2050 for making the existing building stock more efficient. MEPs got them introduced into the Energy Efficiency Directive. They're quite light touch. All that member states have to do is have a plan by April next year. So now is the moment to ask lots of awkward questions about the plan. Who is writing it? Is it going to be ambitious? If not, why not? And why are you jeopardizing the economy by not having a good plan? I asked these questions in London and found that no one has started on the plan yet because there's a disagreement as to whether it's going to be written by the Department for Energy and Climate Change or the Department for Communities and Local Government. That shouldn't be a behind-the-scenes interdepartmental dispute. It should be front-page news, given the huge difference this plan can make to the energy bills of millions of UK households over the next decades. Secondly, let's tackle the assertion that there is no money. Finance has never been so cheap as it is now. In my own constituency, the North East of England, Durham County Council borrowed £1.3 million at a low rate of interest in order to make 4 leisure and sports centres in County Durham more energy efficient. Thanks to improvements to the heating and lighting systems, the council will now save over £150,000 a year in energy costs. Contrast that with the UK's Green Deal, which is being hampered by a rate of interest set way higher than it needs to be. Pay-as-you-save schemes can work well, as evident in Germany and Estonia, but not if the loan is made too dear. The UK government now faces the embarrassment that installers of insulation are being laid off, and the rate of cavity wall insulation is only 20% what it was a year ago. National finance ministers need to realise that refusing to make money available for energy efficiency now, while it is cheap, is bad economics. A third point to watch is transport. A lot of the debate around energy efficiency rightly centres on buildings, but for the sectors of the economy which are outside the emissions trading scheme, more greenhouse gas emissions now come from transport than from buildings in most member states. I'll try and find a slide to show this, but I'm not quite sure what I'm doing. There we are. Just take a look at that. It was quite a surprise to me to see how in some countries buildings are actually a relatively small part now of greenhouse gas emissions, whereas in some countries they are still as much of a problem as the other sectors. So more needs to be done on energy efficiency and transport, and certainly I noticed that here at eceee we have several panel sessions on transport this week. But if a lot of the action ahead is about national economic efficiency, it doesn't mean that we can all have a rest in Brussels. There is still a lot to do at a European level. Fuel efficiency is being driven down by the 2015 and 2020 targets for cars and vans, and MEPs in trilogue negotiations with the Council are pushing for some indications to be given already for the targets for 2025. This is being fought over right now at this very moment in a meeting in Brussels. On products, setting minimum energy performance standards can only happen at a European level. It's an ongoing process that must be kept on track and up to speed. The process goes most smoothly when politicians don't meddle in it. But staying hands-off can be a difficult thing for a politician to do. I had never realised that there were so many male MEPs who are so interested in vacuum cleaning. I want to finish with a picture. This picture is a happy reminder that what's done here in Europe on energy efficiency really can change the world. It's a little bit dark, I hope you can see it. It's a picture of a Chinese fridge. As you can see, it has an efficiency label modelled on the EU A to G, but with numbers. So there are now not only 500 million European consumers benefiting from EU product labelling, but also 1 billion Chinese consumers. Only it doesn't stop there, because this photo was taken not in China, but in East Timor, next door to Indonesia. So wherever the Chinese are selling their goods, and that means pretty well everywhere in Africa and the Pacific, then the EU label is helping people to save energy. So I've got two conclusions. The first is that action at an EU level has a reach way beyond what we may imagine. But the second conclusion is that where it does not always reach is into the minds of our national and local authorities. There we have work to do. I hope this week, with its theme, Rethink, Renew, Restart, will give us the tools to go to the politicians as they worry about the economy and show them that energy efficiency is the answer that they're looking for. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. I think and thank you for the nice words about the summer study and for the good views on what we have to do as next step to continue our work with energy efficiency. I would then like to invite Claudia Canevari from the European Commission to come up here to give her a presentation on energy efficiency in 2020 and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. For me, it is the first time in this very important seminar, and it is a privilege for me to be here. I know that many ideas on energy efficiency are conceived and tested here, so I think it's really important to meet again here. I will talk to you about EU energy efficiency policy, what we are doing to reach the 20% by 2020, because we're still working for that, and also what needs to be done, in our opinion, or what we are thinking about for beyond that date. I hope yes. So the key challenges for 2020 relate to 3 areas the Commission is working upon. The full transposition and implementation of the Energy Efficiency Directive, the ongoing work on eco-design, and the ongoing work on the energy performance of buildings. And as regards 2030, the main framework of our activities is in relation to the Green Paper on 2030, present in public consultation. And I will touch upon all these 3 areas in the course of my presentation. The Energy Efficiency Directive that entered into force in December last year is an ambitious and comprehensive piece of legislation. And there are 4 milestones that need to be particularly highlighted, not only as they require fast action, but also because they are the pillars of the directive. And one of the deadlines for these actions has already passed, while the others are still ahead of us. As you know, member states were asked to notify the Commission their indicative national energy efficiency targets by the 30th of April of this year. And all member states but 3 had communicated their targets to the Commission by the deadline, and 1 arrived in the meantime. And the fact that 25 out of 27 member states have communicated their targets is seen by the Commission as a positive signal of the importance that member states give to the energy efficiency and to the Energy Efficiency Directive. It was the first test case in this respect. Some targets were rightly calculated in the sense that they included all the requirements of the Energy Efficiency Directive, while others were not completely expressed. And for these member states that were not giving all the details, the Commission has already asked for further information, so we started a dialogue with the member states. As you know, the targets were published on the 29th of May as part of European semester, and they are included in the thematic fiche Europe 2020 targets, climate change and energy, that could be found on the site that I'm indicating on the slide, and you will get it, and is what Fiona was mentioning before. And in the, there is quite a comprehensive table that you can see on this slide that is available online with all the different indications, all the numbers of the targets of the member states. The communication on the targets and the annual reporting of the ED links, in fact, closely to the European semester cycle. The national reform programs and the European semester process allow the European Commission to have a systematic dialogue with member states at a high level. The ED even foresees that member states can use the European semester cycle in order to communicate to inform about the annual reports. However, only few of the member states chose this avenue. The majority decided to have a special communication with the annual reports. A good number of these reports have been in fact received. They will be published by the Commission in the EED pages on the Europa site as soon as they are received, and some have already in fact being uploaded, so you can find them. The Commission will make an assessment of the annual reports with a focus on the national energy efficiency targets, and in that occasion we might also give some indications on how we estimate the level of ambition. Technically, we will now comment upon the national reform program for the June European Council. And in parallel, what we did was informing the member states on the level of ambition in the EED committee that took place on the 29th of May. And organizationally within DG Energy in the Commission, we have introduced a country desk system so as to be able to tracking in a closer way the progress each member state is doing. If we have now a close look at the national energy indicative targets, it could be said that 18 targets were correctly expressed in primary energy, and another 18 were correctly expressed in final energy. And even though these concerns different sets of member states, the data could still be comparable. And so far, our estimation is that the results are encouraging, because based on the targets that the member states notified, a preliminary conclusion is that these member states are collectively working towards a level of ambition that is comparable with and close to the overall EU target for 2020. The 18 primary energy values sum up to 1247.5 MTOEs, about 82.6% of the EU target of 1474 MTOE in 2020. And as a point of comparison, these member states accounted for 84.7% of EU primary energy consumption in 2010. And the 18 final energy values sum up to 764.4 MTOEs, 70.9% of the EU target in 2020. And these member states accounted for 67.7% share of EU final energy consumption in 2010. Clearly, we cannot make a conclusion at the moment. The final will be done only when all targets and levels have been reported. Before I go on, I just would like to make a clarification. The Commission used the 2010 data just for the sake of the exercise and the matter of comparison, just to have some proportion and some scale. It is, of course, for the Member States to decide how to set their targets, and we would not suggest in any way that the 2010 share of consumption should be also chosen for 2020. And I have two more slides that I would like to show you in this respect. One, those of you that have already followed recent presentations by the Commission are quite familiar with, that shows where we are with the three targets and where it is shown that in relation to energy efficiency, the gap is decreasing. And the second one, where the gap is expressed in MTOEs. I mean, as I mentioned, the presentation will be available, so you will get these easily. As regards the ED, there are a few more milestones that, as I mentioned, are really the key elements we are focusing upon. It's the design of Article 7, which needs to be done by the end of the year, the preparation of the first NIPs under the EED, and the assessment that the Commission will make by June 2014 of whether the Member States are collectively on track to reach the 20% target. As there is not much time, I will not elaborate now on these points. The timely transposition and ambitious implementation of the ED is a key success for the EU policy on energy efficiency, and this is why the Commission has put a lot of energies and time and resources in supporting the Member States. As you know, we've been working on 7 interpretative notes on those articles of the directive that are either particularly complex, like Article 7, or introducing new concepts like Article 15 with demand response. These notes have been extensively discussed with Member States in the EED committee. They've been shared with a big number of European stakeholders, and they've always been sent to Council and Parliament. We really thought that this transparent process was essential, not only to get as much as possible a complete picture of the problems and of the possible solutions, but also to create a sense of ownership with all the parties concerned. The interpretative notes have been put in inter-service consultation, which was completed last Friday, and we are now assessing the replies. And our internal aim is still to have them adopted by the end of the month. If we now move to the areas of our energy efficiency policy to reach the 20% target in 2020, another area is the product policy, where we had 32 eco-design, energy labeling regulations in place by the end of 2012, and the corresponding savings have been calculated in 430 terawatt-hours annually by 2020. And the objective we have is even more ambitious, because the idea is to have some 30 new implementing measures to be adopted before the end of 2014, corresponding to saving of some 771 terawatt-hours annually by 2020. And that will be a massive step up of the saving efforts and a clear contribution to reach the 2020 goals. Clearly, all these requires a lot of action and activities, and it's also very important because the eco-design is linking more closely to other directives, like, for example, the conversion factor from final into primary energy in the ED and the building requirements of the PBD. And this gives me an introduction to the buildings that are central to the EU energy efficiency policy. Improving their energy is crucial for the EU to reach its 20% 2020 target, but also the climate objectives, and at the same time maintaining the security of the energy supply. There is an enormous unrealized saving potential in buildings, and this is why the Commission is concentrating a lot in this area. And you can see in this slide a snapshot indication, but also quite comprehensive of where we stand. And transposition of the Energy Performance of Building Directive is shown as reported by Member States. Green is full transposition, orange partial, and red no transposition. For those member states that have notified transposition measures, the Commission is doing the so-called prima facie checks, basically verifying if all provisions have been transposed. And for those that have communicated transposition, then there is the conformity check carried on to assess if the various provisions and requirements of the directive have been effectively transposed in national law. As regards nearly zero energy buildings reports and the cost optimal calculations, the status is based on whether or not reports have been received, is not an assessment of the completeness of the report. And the Commission is undertaking an analysis of the reports received. There are some issues in the EPBD that need to be looked at, and we are working to see how they could be further developed. And on enforcement, for example, the Commission is closely monitoring the transposition and implementation of the EPBD by Member States, and Member States are supposed to do on their side the establishment of independent control systems on energy performance certificates and inspection reports. On indoor air quality, just to mention another of these areas listed in this slide, is very important in the context of the nearly zero energy buildings and also for other airtight buildings. There are not so far many concrete plans to address these, and colleagues in the Director General of the Commission responsible for health have created a working group to deal with that. And this seminar we are attending this week could be an excellent opportunity to gather some ideas on all these issues. Robert and I from the Energy Efficiency Unit is also here and is the expert on buildings. So I'm sure you will have a lot of very good, interesting discussion with him. Energy efficiency does not stop, as we know very well, in 2020. On the contrary, major economic potential will only be unlocked thereafter, and building retrofit is an example. And this is also shown in Roadmap 2050, where regardless of the scenario one looks at, energy efficiency is central for reaching our energy policy aim, is, as you know very well, a no-regret option. And therefore, this brings us to the question of further milestones, for example, as regards 2030, in relation to energy efficiency, but also other components of the EU energy climate policy, like the targets related to GHG reductions or policies in relation to renewables. The aim of the Green Paper that is presently in public consultation is to get feedback from stakeholders on key energy climate issues within the 2030 timeframe. And the idea is to propose a framework for 2030 that would reflect the trajectory the EU needs to be in order to decarbonize its economy by 2050. And such a framework should also factor strongly other aspects, which are a matter of particular concern, and this is in particular competitiveness and the impact of high prices on business and consumers. And following the Green Paper, a policy initiative will be published by the end of 2013. And for the moment, it is unclear what kind of form or status it will take. There are different opinions, different views about this. And there are some parts of the Commission that wish to have already at that moment a legislative proposal, or at least some legislative elements. For example, in relation to the ETS, could it be, for example, 42% CO2 target for 2030, or in relation to renewables, for example, 30% share for 2030, but only for some part of the economy, for example, excluding transport. These are some hypotheses. The problem for energy efficiency is that we are, let's say, in a different time in relation to the policy cycle, because the ED, as you know, has just been adopted, has just entered into force. A review is scheduled for June 2014, and therefore there is not so much willingness at the moment to have energy efficiency included with sound prominence. There are various elements that are being considered, and answers to the key questions that are on this slide is highly relevant for energy efficiency. Let me go briefly through them. As regards the lessons for 2020, the first lesson is that a quantified target for energy efficiency has provided political momentum, guidance for investors, and a clear mandate for the Commission to come forward with a legislative proposal, with legislative proposals to ensure progress, such as the Energy Efficiency Directive. The second lesson is that the targets need to be better coordinated, as there are synergies, but there could also be negative impacts between all of them. Therefore, they need to be taken into consideration all at the same time. And the third lesson is that agreeing on legislation is not enough. The experience of the Buildings Directive gives us the indication that one thing is having legislation on paper, and the other thing is having member states implementing it and monitoring. What targets for 2030? Given that the EU energy efficiency framework in the EED has just been adopted, and that the Commission is making an assessment by June 2014, it's a little bit premature to have energy saving targets until these, the 2020 situation is clearer. On the other hand, as we know, energy efficiency is a no-regret option, and therefore it must continue to be a fundamental part of the energy efficiency policy also in the 2030 perspective. Not considering the three targets together will result in the incoherent approach that was mentioned before. And, for example, an aspirational energy saving target for 2030 could therefore be considered. It could then be translated into policy proposal at a later stage after 2014, when the key elements of the pictures for 2020 will be clearer. In any case, irrespective of what is decided, it's clear that there are different options for the formulation of the energy saving targets in the future. And while an absolute target for 2020 better ensures to meet certain ambition levels, a relative target would better reflect the structural dynamics. A mix could also be considered. For example, for certain sectors it could be relative targets, and for other sectors it could be an absolute targets. For example, industry for the relative and residential for the absolute. And in any case, there have to be different benchmarks for energy savings, and that benchmarks could be different. Could be, for example, past levels. Could be business as usual projections for 2030, just to name a couple of them. So, what instruments for 2030? The focus certainly should be on implementation of the current framework, and that would be very important, for example, in relation to the need to stimulate greater and more easily accessible financing. For 2030, efforts will need to be stepped up, and therefore there is the need to be creative about what measures we should be considering. For example, extending the energy efficiency obligations beyond the 2020 with more limited flexibilities or greater ambition, strengthen the EPBD, and, for example, to drive upwards the renovation rate. And these are just a few examples. Finally, on competitiveness, this is an increasing important aspect as energy efficiency is considered to be the cheapest way to drive down greenhouse gas emissions. However, there are some parts of the economies that consider it a threat, and that would like only to see the ETS as the only instrument. This is something that certainly would need to be looked at. So, just to summarize these last points on 2030, there are the following questions that remain. First of all, should there be a binding energy efficiency targets for 2030? If yes, how these should be combined with all other targets? If not, as an alternative to targets, are member states ready to accept additional binding measures? And finally, which sector should be taken into consideration? In 2014, we will evaluate all these data we have to see whether the EU is on track to reach the 20% 2020 energy efficiency target. And so it seems premature, as I mentioned, to give some conclusions on where we should be in relation to energy efficiency in 2030. all the same objectives have a clear signal function as we see with the 2020. At this point in time, what we see is, in fact, the need for discussion, for confrontation, for debate above all. The challenges, in fact, summing up, are multiple, but when challenges are multiple, then it means that so as also the opportunities. So there is a lot to be looked at and to realize, and certainly this week will offer many opportunities to give a substantial contribution to all these debates, and I'm very much look forward to participating in these discussions. And I would like to wish all of us a very successful week and thank again to the organizers for having gathered us here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claudia, for this good overview on existing directives, some of the challenges by proper implementation, also some good updated information on where we seem to be today to meet the 20% target, and some thoughts about the 2030 framework. I think there's a lot of things to discuss, and I will come back to them. But now we'll go to the third presentation. Brook, Riley, and Erika Hope from the NGO side has a title called Efficient Thinking, Outlook to 2030. And please.
Well, thank you very much, and we're very happy to be here at the summer study. This is Brook, who is a climate campaigner at Friends of the Earth Europe and has never been to the summer study before.
Ouch, I can hear that one. And this is Erika Hope, who's now with the European Climate Foundation, and before that, for I think 2.5 years, was my partner in crime when she was at Climate Action Network, and we were working together on the Energy Efficiency Directive.
And both of our organisations are very closely involved with the Coalition for Energy Savings, which many of you may have heard of. This is a unique cross-sectoral coalition, which includes industry organisations, NGOs, social housing. We've now got a trade union, and it really is the voice of energy savings in Brussels. And there's a lot of representatives of it here in the room. I don't think we have a special spot on our badge, but maybe next year, then we'll really know we've made it. So anyway, as you will have picked up, the contents. So we're just going to first talk a bit about the Energy Efficiency Directive, which, as you will gather, is one of the very big, important things that has been happening in Europe over the last couple of years.
And then we're going to talk about the 2014 review, and we're going to ask ourselves and you a challenging question, whether we should be just trying to meet the 20% by 2020 target, or whether actually maybe we should be looking at being more ambitious for 2020.
And then we're going to look at this question of political will, really. So as I think Fiona described it, it's been a bit of a slog lately, getting anything accepted. So we need to ask ourselves why this is and what we can possibly do about that.
So I think that to pick up on Fiona's message, quite a lot of nagging is going to be needed for that, but we're also going to be needing to really push extremely hard to get something that is adequate and ambitious for 2030 as well. So there's really a lot happening with energy savings at the moment. It's an exciting time, I think.
I'd agree. Now, first to look at the Energy Efficiency Directive. I think you probably will all have seen this graph or versions of it many times before. This was the situation before the Energy Efficiency Directive was agreed. If the EU has this target of reducing its energy consumption by 20% compared to business as usual. As of 2011, it looked like it would miss this target by about half, and the Energy Efficiency Directive was proposed in order to try and close that gap. Now, I think all of our organisations would agree that the Energy Efficiency Directive really is a step forward. It does put the 20% target into EU law for the first time in quantified fashion. It also introduces the EU's very first actual binding energy efficiency target, the 1.5% target that you've heard talked about already. It also opens the door for some very important new policy avenues, including the energy company obligation schemes, the renovation roadmaps, new financing possibilities, and so on. But it isn't as good as we'd hoped. This is the coalition's gapometer. So the big rainbow is the distance that would have been needed to go to close the gap to the 20% target. And unfortunately, at the end of all of the discussions, we had about half of the target being closed. So the coalition's estimates is that the directive would deliver about 15% savings by 2020 instead of 20%. Now, if you add the energy labelling measures for boilers and water heaters, and also some new forthcoming standards for cars and CO2, this might get up to about 17% if you just do a pure impact assessment of the legislation, but it's still not 20. And this is because it's politics. It's the art of compromise. The Commission's proposal originally was still not actually closing the gap, but was more ambitious than what was eventually agreed. What was agreed was a whole lot weaker than what the European Parliament proposed. And, you know, we got what we got, and it was a hell of a fight, as was described by Martin Lidegaard, who was the Danish energy minister who was in charge of the council side of the negotiations.
Although I have to sometimes wonder what sort of lions they were, whether they were really the wild, wild ones or slightly less wild than we might have hoped at times. But anyway.
You might be right.
I might be right.
So I think essentially we would share Fiona's view, really, that the politician's heart just isn't in it. However much they say they like energy efficiency and they like energy savings, when it actually comes to it, they opposed having the target be made binding, and they said instead that they wanted binding measures. But then what actually happened was each measure, so all those measures, the different coloured bits of the rainbow you saw there, got whittled down and whittled down and whittled down, and it just gives them lots of fronts to fight on and whittle them down rather than just the one big one of the target.
Right.
And Brook wants to tell us about a particular example of that.
Thank you, Erica. So the main measure in the directive is this binding 1.5% annual savings target. And that's a great step forward because it's the first time we've actually had a binding target. However, when you factor in loopholes that member states pushed for during the negotiations, it's not actually a 1.5% target. It's reduced by about 25%. So actually, we're talking about a 1.1% annual savings target. And unfortunately, the bad news is that that's here to stay. It's written into the directive. It's part of Article 7. However, we believe, Claudia perhaps can confirm this during question time afterwards, but we believe that a loophole has been closed. Now, what I'm going to do is explain to you briefly the concept of early action, which if you're trying to dodge your commitment to meet energy savings targets is a really good thing to try and understand. Now, the whole principle about this energy efficiency directive is that it looks at where we were going to be in 2020 without the energy efficiency directive and then proposes new measures to close that gap. So the key point, I'm sure you'll understand, is that these savings are new and they're additional to what would have happened anyway. Now, early action gets around that by crediting savings that were made in the past to meet a target for the future. So it's an accounting trick. It's a fudge, if you like, which means that statistically targets might well be met, but in practice the real savings are much, much less. Now, the good news is that the UK, which was quite a cunning, underhand negotiator in the Energy Efficiency Directive, that's my view, I'll hasten to add. They negotiated for an additional loophole in return for signing up to the directive. This additional loophole was early action on top of this 25% reduction, which I've just mentioned to you. Now, we estimated that this would mean that the UK would not have to meet a 1.5% target, not have to meet a 1.1% target, but actually the real target would be around about 0.7. Now, we blogged about this, we tried to get articles written about this, but it's a very technical point and it's difficult to get it out there. However, in the end, 3 countries, Finland, Germany and Austria, wrote to the Commission to complain about this exemption. And the Commission referred the matter to their legal service. And the good news is that the legal service wrote back saying, well, actually, this special UK loophole doesn't really have any foundation in the directive. It's no more than a gentleman's agreement, which doesn't actually stand up to legal scrutiny. So the interpretive note on Article 7, which, as Claudia has explained, is currently in inter-service consultation, the draft that we have seen rejects this loophole for the UK, and that's really superb news. We're talking about roughly 20 million tons of CO2 between now and 2020, and rough back-of-the-envelope calculations show that's about 30 million transatlantic flights. It's a lot of energy, a lot of CO2 emissions that we're talking about. However, I speak with the fear, the slight fear that during the inter-service consultation, this loophole might have been reopened. So, as I said, I'm very keen to hear Claudia's views on this, but nonetheless, it's a very important step forward. And I think Erica is going to tell us how we could avoid such loopholes in the future.
Well, before we do that, I just would like to, and by the way, what Brook has given you there is just one example of some of the amusing work that we entertain ourselves with in a sort of day-to-day basis when it comes to this legislation. But another thing that many of the people in Brussels have been doing is preparing a guidebook for implementation of the Energy Efficiency Directive. Now, this guidebook is intended to help stakeholders in member states scrutinise the way the directive is being transposed in member states and the way it's being implemented. And also, you know, there's nothing in it that we would mind the implementers themselves reading it. So this guidebook will hopefully pop up from time to time during this week. There's a particular session to present it on Thursday at 4:30. Quick advert there. But basically, the idea is to get action on the ground so that we really do start to have, you know, the consequences of the Energy Efficiency Directive being seen, partly because that will deliver energy savings, and partly because if we can start to see some success stories, that might start to encourage some of these politicians that more EU legislation on this topic is a good idea. So, yes, now having looked at the Energy Efficiency Directive itself, as Claudia described, there are a number of deadlines in the directive, and the one that has already passed was for member states to submit their own national targets. Now, the coalition made quite a lot of effort to find out what these targets were, and the best of our efforts prior to actually having these results that have been just released from the Commission last week, found that actually the targets that have been submitted so far look like they wouldn't close the gap to the 20% target, and if the targets that we thought were missing would be of a similar order of magnitude as the ones that had been submitted, there would still be a gap of about 62 million tonnes of oil equivalent to the 20% target. And obviously, if the Commission assesses that the target is not to be met, then it will need to come forward with further measures next year. Although, as we have just seen, the Commission's assessment based on the actual information is rather more optimistic. So we'll have to see what happens there.
Yeah, if I could just make a quick point about these two graphs. You see, when we look at member states' strategy on energy efficiency, it's not all that supportive, positive. They tend to find ways to try and water down legislation. Now, one concern that we have is that member states might well be submitting targets which are in line with the 20% objective, yet there might not be all that much thinking behind that proposal which will actually lead to those savings being delivered. So the danger is that in June 2014, the Commission might well look at what member states have reported, decide that on the basis of those fairly ambitious proposals, binding targets are not needed. And yet, in the follow-up to that, member states' implementation of those energy savings proposals might actually be very weak, and it will not be picked up until it's too late, until we're too close to 2020. So what I'm saying is it's very important that when we look at the targets that member states have proposed, it's not just the number, it's not just the superficial description of how they propose to meet them, it's really the in-depth structural change that member states need to put in place. If they have proposals to do so, then all is looking good. If they don't, on the other hand, then perhaps we really need to look into the need for binding targets in 2014 and to be really critical, I think, about the member state proposals.
Brook, you're such a cynic to think that the member states might exaggerate. So, I mean, I guess we have to hope that the Commission will be very vigilant in looking into these. But actually, given that I know you like to be cynical and contrary, I think you'd like to tell us about why the 20% target may not be enough.
Yes. Sorry, I pressed the button twice. I guess most of you know the name James Hansen. He headed NASA's work on climate change for, I think, over 30 years. He was in Brussels 3 weeks ago, and he was talking about, unfortunately, the lackluster efforts to address climate change. And he made one point, which I found quite stupendous, actually, when you stop and you think about it. The Commission is basing its greenhouse gas emissions policies on a 2-degree commitment. The idea is to avoid climate change, avoid global warming, going beyond a threshold of 2 degrees. Now, what you don't actually know is that behind that number, there is a very significant risk assessment, a 50% chance only of staying below 2 degrees. So we're not actually going for a 2-degree target, we're going for a 50% chance of staying below 2 degrees. And just to be fair, I should add that many NGOs, myself included, we don't actually work on the basis of a 100% chance of staying below 2 degrees either. But the Commission's risk assessment is considerably, well, riskier, I'm sorry to use the word, than ours. In fact, you could argue that they are risking what they themselves describe as disastrous climate change on a coin toss, which is quite alarming when you think about it. But James Hansen goes further. He, in a recent report which has been submitted to the NASA, he warns that aiming at 2 degrees, policies to deliver a 2-degree threshold, because of the inertia of the oceans that tend to soak up heat and then release them in a rather sudden and unexpected way, would actually lead to temperature increases of 3 to 4 degrees over the next 100 to couple of 100 years. Now, this is quite a devastating perspective, and it throws into really sharp relief the importance of energy savings, which we have heard is the most cost-effective way to cut emissions. Now, one more point. This is another graph from James Hansen, and it's illustrating the fact that we have only used approximately 1/5 of the available fossil fuels. And if we were to go ahead and use all that remains, we would be blowing our carbon budgets to hell. Carbon budgets being the total volume of emissions that we can safely emit over the next 50 to 100 years. So the key message is leave fossil fuels underground if you wish to have a chance of avoiding climate change. Now, if we are going to do so, we're going to have to be dramatically ambitious, I would say, on energy savings and renewables. And what this means, if we want to be on a sustainable pathway to 2030, 2040, 2050, we almost certainly have to revise our current ambition for energy savings for 2020. We have to consider not just meeting the 20% target, but going beyond that. So I put it to you that the 2014 review is not just about delivering an existing goal, it's about considering whether something much more ambitious is in fact needed.
Very sobering reality there. Unfortunately, as well as the scientific reality, we have to contend with the political reality. And given the, I would completely agree with you, but given the difficulty that we seem to have even getting the 20% target met, it's looking like a tough call to get something higher than that met, and also to get something of sufficient ambition in place for 2030. So we just thought we'd talk a bit about how this, basically, getting this political will really depends on whether or not you see energy efficiency as a burden or an opportunity. Now, we think that there's a real need to change the mindset towards the opportunity kind of paradigm. And one way to do this could be to actually take a bit of a harder look at the status quo, or at business as usual. When we're talking about strong climate and energy legislation, we've noticed that we're often rather on the defensive. We're trying to make out that it's not going to be that much more expensive, or, you know, hey, it might actually generate some extra jobs. But actually, if you really scrutinise what would be the alternative, carrying on with business as usual, then it's not actually quite as rosy as those who prefer to keep quiet about it would have us believe. We actually have a situation in the EU where 25 out of 27 member states are net importers of energy. And what this totals up to is a situation whereby, if we look at the major energy-using regions of the world, the EU is second only to Japan in its dependency on imported fuel. And it's going to increase massively over the next few years. So by 2035, it will be well over 80% combined dependency on oil and gas. So it's obviously a price taker. And This is in a situation where, under all scenarios, apart from a fairly, well, not that ambitious, a decarbonisation scenario, fossil fuel prices are really going to rise quite substantially. So the European Commission actually, in its own roadmaps, has pointed out that if we would go for these decarbonisation policies, which include strong policies on energy efficiency, we would be saving between 500 and 550 billion euros a year by 2050. And actually, we think that is only the tip of the iceberg. Because if you start thinking then about spending that money within the EU, rather than sending it out to third countries, then actually the knock-on effects of the macroeconomic impacts of that money could be really quite substantial. And that's something that the European Climate Foundation is looking at quite closely. But Brook, I saw you looking a bit uncomfortable with this slide.
Well, especially we were talking about it on the train down. When you look at that slide, you think, well, yes, European Union, clearly renewables and efficiency are desperately needed. But you look at the United States and you think, well, what message is the International Energy Agency trying to get across? Is it that shale gas is the solution and that by massively developing shale gas, costs will fall and so will energy independence? Now, I personally believe, and emerging reports from the United States confirm this, that the EU can only go down a right path by developing efficiency and renewables instead of shale gas, simply because there are far fewer comebacks. I remember reading a quote from the CEO of ExxonMobil, who was complaining that his company is losing its shirts with shale gas. In other words, the extraction costs of shale gas are far higher than the actual profits they are making from it. Unfortunately, this notion that a boom of shale gas would restore competitiveness in the EU is a very prevalent one. It's a very common one at the higher you go in the Brussels decision-making process. What we need to do is to get out there and explain that in terms of job creations, in terms of simplicity of legislation, in terms of multiple benefits in environmental, social, employment, etc., we can only gain by going for efficiency and renewables instead of for shale gas. So I know that I'm preaching to the converted here, but believe me, when you go and talk to senior people in the Commission or the Council or even the Parliament, then you're going to hear a different message. So just to highlight that, I think.
Oh dear, this was supposed to have lots of pictures on it. Oh, they do. Okay, they do come. So, yeah, okay, fine. So we basically, the macroeconomic conclusion would be that generally speaking, energy efficiency would be a very good idea. If we look at actually how you deliver energy efficiency, obviously you'll all know very well the KfW scheme, which is one of the best analysed examples of a successful renovations programme. And we see that it creates a great number of jobs. It has resulted in a great many homes being refurbished, and essentially it results in a €5 return for every euro that is spent on the programme. So
multiple benefits indeed.
Essentially.
This is a report which you might find very interesting reading. We commissioned it last year, so it was a Climate Action Network, Friends of the Earth Europe commission. Ecofis, the well-known research institute, estimate that if we had ambitious energy-saving policies by 2030, by which they mention a 35% reduction in energy use, we would be getting net financial savings of roughly 250 billion euros per year. So it's extremely significant. It's in the same ballpark as what the EU currently spends on oil and gas imports. I think that the next step is to look at how ambitious we should be for 2030. We understand the economic case is extremely compelling. Now let's look at what is actually on the table in terms of proposals. So the top line, or rather perhaps I should focus on the second line. The second line, the orange line, is what the Commission is currently recommending as its most ambitious scenario for 2030, 2040 and 2050. Now, ironically, you will see that under the Commission's energy efficiency scenario, the 20% by 2020 target is not actually met, which was a bit strange given that at the same time they were developing the Energy Efficiency Directive. However, the number that I find most interesting is that one represented by the blue line beneath it. That is a report by Fraunhofer, a German research institute for the German Environment Ministry. And what they're saying is that reductions of about 50% below current levels by 2030 are cost effective and would lead to emission cuts of roughly 55% or more below 1990 levels. So what we're seeing is a huge gap between what the Commission is currently proposing for 2030 and what is estimated to be cost effective and desirable by a very reputed research group. Now, we did a few calculations to try and estimate what this difference is, and as you can see, it comes to about 13 times Germany's current energy use. This is the difference in potential between what is currently being considered by the Commission and what we judge to be necessary for 2030 if we're really going to bring about this energy system change, which seems necessary, which seems vital from a greenhouse gas emission reduction perspective.
So obviously getting the consumption level for 2030 right is going to be very important. And then, as Claudia was alluding to, there will be important discussions to be had about how that target is designed, whether it's binding, whether it's a primary energy target or a final energy target or a mix of different sectoral targets. And I think probably there will be many interesting discussions and advice to be given about that during the course of this week. But I think we'd just like to say that one thing that we absolutely agree with the Commission about, well, with what Claudia just presented, was that there absolutely does need to be something very specific on energy efficiency. Because as well as the energy price discussion and the shale gas discussion and the competitiveness discussion, one of the other things which is very kind of live and hot in Brussels at the moment is whether or not we should just have a greenhouse gas target as our climate and energy framework for 2030, and whether we can rely on carbon pricing and emissions trading to deliver energy efficiency. Now, I really don't think it's necessary, and we're also out of time pretty much, to explain to you lot why that isn't right. But I thought I just would show one of my favourite slides of the moment, which is from Christina Hood of the International Energy Agency, who has really made a very good case as to why carbon pricing is not sufficient. It mediates economy-wide action, so it gives an investment signal towards low-carbon choices in the future. But when you're talking about negative cost options, which obviously many energy efficiency options are, it's clearly not going to do the trick. And neither is it going to work for some of the more expensive new renewable energy technology options. So I think we're there. So we would just pretty much conclude that good implementation of the 2020 framework is going to be extremely important, and you should all make sure you have a look at the Coalition's guidebook to see how to make that happen.
And very much that we need to get more in line with climate science. We are clearly out of it, and energy efficiency can help us bring back in line.
Looking at energy savings is really an opportunity and not a burden, and we might realise that a bit more strongly if we asked ourselves some serious questions about how enjoyable life really would be under business as usual.
And finally, and perhaps most importantly at the moment, we're working on an extremely tight deadline for the 2030 framework proposal. As Claudia mentioned, we could have something as early as the end of this year, beginning of next. And this preparation work is happening at a time of very difficult economic perspectives, and we're trying to get ambition at a time when economic concerns are pushing for delay and for something that is much less ambitious, for something that is a compromise. And I think we have to turn it round so that we're showing efficiency as a key driver for economic recovery, as well as all those multiple other benefits as well.
We will now go to the debate, and I'll ask the speakers to come up here, and that we will have some microphones go around. If I should just try to make some observations of the three presentations in common. I think the first observation, which was in almost all three presentations, is that we have problems with implementation of existing directives and legislation, and the member states are the bad guys. So that's was one observation. And just to give a remark on my minister was fighting as a lion. When we were at the president of EU to get the EED approved or agreed, and we had only two objectives. One was to keep the ambitions as high as possible, and second one was to find a compromise before the end of our presidency. But my first reflection was the problems with implementation and member states. Second thing, which I heard in most of the presentation, is that we need new initiatives and stronger initiatives, especially in relation to existing buildings, to products, eco-design, and we also have to look at transport. And my third observation is to the 2030 framework. I've heard that we have to look at targets and improving energy efficiency there, but I can also see that we have a timing problem. Claudia said that it's premature to look on an energy saving target for 2030 before the 2014 assessment of progress. On the other hand, the European Council here in May decided to ask the Commission to come with a proposal for the 2030 framework before the end of this year, and it have to be discussed at the European Council meeting in March 2014. So we have a conflict of time, and I don't know how we solve that, but that was some of my observation here. And now we will open up for questions from the floor. And please, when you ask for a question, tell your names and say who you will address the question to, please. Thank you.
I would like to thank all the speakers for those three very inspiring and informative presentations. I learned a lot this afternoon. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, my name is Stefan Thomas from the Wuppertal Institute in Germany. I have an observation on the nature of targets, because you informed us that there is a debate on whether there should be absolute targets or relative targets. But how can you avoid the problem that we had with the 2020 targets, that they were not consistent, if you have an energy efficiency target that is relative? Because if it's not an absolute target, then you're not sure of where you get in energy consumption, and together with the renewable energy target, then you're also not sure where you get in terms of the emissions target, the greenhouse gas emissions target. So I think most people here in the room will join me in the conclusion that also was presented by Erika and Brook, that we need an energy efficiency target together with the greenhouse gas and renewable energy targets. And my argument is that, yeah, in order to be consistent, the energy savings target must be an absolute target. So, thank you.
Okay, Petr Holub, Chance for Buildings, Czech Republic. Very good overview what's going on the political and legislative level in the EU, and what are the problems and challenges we're facing at the moment in the national states. What my question would be is on the financing, because at the end, money talks. Money is the important thing for making the renovation roadmaps to happen, saving energy in the buildings. So we are looking at the EU ETS and the allowance price collapsing. So will be there any renewal of the EU ETS? Would there be a proposal for backloading coming again, or for taking some of the allowances from the market, or admitting that the EU ETS has a high transaction cost and we need a carbon tax, which is a simpler version of the same thing? And so that's one part of the question. The other is the EU funds, because 2013 is the year when we are making decisions about utilization of the EU funds in the next programming period, 2014 to 2020. That's the huge amounts of money coming to the national states, particularly on the central eastern part of the Europe, to the new member states. And we would like to see progressive regulations on the ERDF, the cohesion fund, so that the member states are motivated into investing structural funds into energy efficiency, both for the public buildings and the residential buildings. So that's a question to all of you. And maybe the last question would go primarily to Claudia. Is DG Energy looking into DG Regio negotiating with the member states, and what's the process of coordinating the efforts of the savings, incentives, and the EU funds negotiations? Thanks.
Thank you for the question. As regards the ETS issue, if I'm not mistaken, there will be a colleague from DG Klima present here tomorrow or the day after, Stefan Moser, who is very much into all these discussions. So I think he will be able to tell you what the latest is about the situation in relation to ETS and backloading. As regards the funding, we are very much aware that this is one of the problems related to energy efficiency. We think that the EED is already addressing some of these problems, and in any case, the Commission is putting quite some energies in using the existing sources of financing like structural funds, but also like facilities like ELENA to support member states in their efforts. But what we know is that what will come from public financing will not be enough. So let's say the challenge is to use the public financing which will be available in order to trigger private financing. So it is really a way, it's really into, let's say, imaginative new ways in relation to financing. You might be aware that there is this concerted action of the EED. It is a forum that meets twice a year, but work is going on throughout the year. There are different working groups, and this looks at implementation challenges for the Energy Efficiency Directive. And one of these, let's say, working group is looking into financing. And this is why the reason why that was selected by both the member states and the Commission as one of the key areas is because we are aware that there is the need to move into, let's say, innovative ways of financing. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
Stefan Scheuer, Coalition for Energy Saving. Sorry for having been late, so I missed the first presentation. I was on the late train with a couple of others. My question to the panelists is whether and in how far in future we need to present energy efficiency much stronger under the banner of competitiveness, whether that's a compelling proposition, whether that is something which would establish the necessity for energy efficiency, not just as the least cost option for addressing climate change, but really at being at the core of addressing competitiveness as it actually is the measurement for competitiveness at a large part, the productivity of our economies and society. So that's a very question, I think, to all of the panelists. Would be nice to have your perspective and views on that. I would like to have one little comment on the pie chart of the Commission about the 2020 targets and the fairly positive outlook. I think, of course, it's the Commission's right to see that fairly positive, and probably the Coalition's right to say it's maybe a bit more negative. But I guess what we have seen is that the 86% of the target, the 147 MTUE, would already be reached by countries who make up only 84%, I think, of the consumption. So the 2% gap would be still there. And I think that means also in that outlook, only 18% savings would be achieved and not 20%. And I believe we should be very firm on 20% is 20% and nothing less. Thank you.
If you were on the train, I can say that in my presentation, I did say that I think that the way forward is to really have a go at national and local authorities who are not doing energy efficiency, because if they're not doing energy efficiency, they're not being economically efficient. They're actually being incompetent in terms of their handling of the economy. And I think that is something that we should drive on, and what you said about competitiveness is very much part of that.
When you read the Commission's papers on 2030, you might well be struck by the trade-off between, on the one hand, the need to protect the economy and ensure competitiveness, and on the other, the need for climate action. Very rarely are these two parts joined. In fact, they're considered as separate. They're considered as a trade-off. And this is the fundamental problem which I think we need to address. There is still a fingertip attempt to protect the current energy system, the current economic system, and a reluctance to realize that a change, in this case to a high renewable, high efficiency scenario, is the solution. Now, if you go and talk to Danish officials, of which we have one here, they're going to tell you that for them there is utterly no question that we need to develop the green economy. They're already doing it. They've been doing it for decades. But when you ask them why other member states, whom they speak to regularly in council discussions, are not doing the same, then the answer that we get is that, okay, they see the benefits, they see the midterm, long-term benefits, but they do not have anything that could be considered a green economy and really have no idea how to get about doing it. Therefore, in doubt and concerned about what would happen, they tend to resist and dig in their heels and say no to ambition. So I think that the solution is something a bit which Fiona has been talking about, which is to consider how, with better knowledge, better case studies, better sharing of good practices, you can actually make that leap between the current system and a system based on green technologies, which, as we do know, will lead to greater jobs, greater cost savings, reduced energy imports, etc. I think that for some countries it is almost a leap of faith, and they're not yet prepared to take that leap of faith, and they need having their hand held throughout that path. But I think it's beginning.
And if I might add to that, I mean, I do think it's very important that the climate case continue to be made. The fact that the climate change is a problem, and we need strong legislation because of that. And obviously one of the most resonant ways to do that at the moment will be to talk about the costs of climate risk. And next year there will be a new Stern report, and I think NGOs and those people who are sort of the spokespeople for the climate, let's say NGOs and academics and so on, must do their utmost to make those messages be carried through in the media. But I think otherwise, indeed, competitiveness is the watchword of the moment, and we need to very much make the case for energy efficiency through that. If I might add one other observation about energy efficiency, I think our purposes would be quite well served perhaps if we started to disaggregate the concept a bit. When we talk about energy efficiency being a good idea, well, nobody's going to disagree, are they? I mean, energy efficiency, yes, of course I support energy efficiency, but it's not really putting anybody under very much pressure to do anything at all. So I think we need to start talking about what we actually mean, the specific sectors and the specific actions, and not just bundle it all together as one absolutely apple pie type concept. And I think this will also be helpful when it comes to getting political agreement, because at the end of the day, finance ministers need to be shown that the measures that are being proposed can be paid for, and can be paid for in a time frame that they're interested in. And I think we'll have an easier job demonstrating that if we start to be a bit more specific about the particular measures and so on that we're talking about.
Very much support was what Fiona was saying in her presentation before, and what she repeated now about the importance of, let's say, involving more local, regional, and in any case also national authorities. Because, I mean, the Commission can have ambitious proposals, but as you all know, it is, I mean, the Commission makes the proposal, and then it is the legislator, namely the Council and the Parliament, that will then finally take the decision. So there has to be a better awareness in the member states of what the advantages of energy efficiency could be. Also in a moment where the economy is in a difficult situation, but energy efficiency could help by saving all the money we have, studies have shown. So maybe it's really a way of, there is really the need to put energy efficiency more at the center of the debate, nationally, regionally, locally, so that there is also a demand for these coming from, let's say, the lower administrative levels.
Okay, before we take the next one, I would also give a small reflection or answer to the question from Stefan. And I think that we should continue to say that energy efficiency has three pillars. One is climate change, one is security of energy security, another one is competitiveness or economic growth. And for some years, one of them will be very strong. For next 2 years, the other one. And I think it has always been wrong to argue on energy efficiency only by climate change. We have to argue by climate change for all these three, and for energy efficiency for all these three reasons. And we should continue to do that. Next question is up there.
Yes, Peter. Hal Wilhite from the University of Oslo. I'd just like to pick up on that last point of yours. Can we have our cake and eat it too? Basically, we're saying efficiency is going to give us everything. The theme of the last summer study was energy efficiency for a low-carbon society. The theme of this one seems to be energy efficiency for growth and competitiveness. So I'd like to have the panel members, give us their thoughts on this. In fact, I even see a dichotomy in the terminology that's used. Is it an efficiency, as the first speakers talked about, or savings, as the last speakers talked about? Is it reduction or efficiency? Is it absolute or is it relative? Can we have all of this at the same time?
First of all, on the terminology, you're right. We tend to use efficiency and savings in the same sentence, and we sometimes mean the same thing, sometimes we mean different things. For Friends of the Earth, for NGOs, it is 100% clear that we are talking about an absolute reduction in energy use over the coming years and decades. We believe that only by putting in place what amounts to a limit on the amount of energy that can be consumed, will we get these parallel benefits, which are reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which are using less oil and gas, which are also making it easier to meet a renewable energy target, which, as you know, is calculated on a percentage basis on energy consumption. I think here an important point is that this notion that we're talking about an absolute reduction is not one. It was a big battle on the Energy Efficiency Directive, where some energy-intensive industries who opposed the 20% target were campaigning for an energy intensity target instead. Now, an energy intensity target is a wrong road to take. For example, over the past 20 years, the EU's energy intensity, its relation between GDP and energy consumption, has improved significantly. It has improved by about 30%, but at the same time, energy consumption has gone up over that period. So I think we have to be very clear that we're talking about an absolute reduction in energy use.
I think that energy intensity, relative energy efficiency, can deliver on competitiveness, because if one country or one company uses less energy to deliver the same product as another, it will be more competitive. But that's about the only area which you can get a result on from a relative target for not only the climate but also energy security. It's an actual reduction that you need. So on the whole, I think it's absolutely an absolute reduction that we should be looking for.
You could say that the 20% target is an absolute reduction of 13% compared to 2005. So the question would be, how big should the reduction be for 2030 target? Next question, who is
here?
Hans.
Hello, Hans Nilsson. I would like to turn to Fiona Hall and ask for a piece of advice. Based on Peter's observation that we have the problem in the member states and your statement that we need naming and shaming, I would like some advice on how do we name and shame. Because part of my experience representing NGOs is that when I'm trying to name and shame and put forward our good arguments, we are just shoved away like an irritating fly. So, first of all, which measures should we use for naming and shaming? Should we write debate articles? Should we infiltrate political parties? How should we do it? And where can we find trade allies in naming and shaming? Because I think that there are quite a few, for instance, business associations out there that have exactly the same interest. How do we find them, and how can we make a coalition with them and do the naming and shaming that we need? How would you be named and shamed? It's your choice.
I'm a bit biased, but I'd go for infiltrating the political parties. I can't think of anything that would be better than you infiltrating all the political parties. The difficulty about business is that they keep their heads very low, and we see this on a number of issues. It takes a lot for business people to put their head above the parapet. They did to an extent on Stern first time round. I think that was a good outcome, and I hope that they will do that again. But generally speaking, you know, they don't want to draw attention to themselves. The area where I suppose I most wish that there was more attention is just mainstream media. Again, around Stern, we had some very good programs about climate change in mainstream media, and it's getting onto, you know, primetime television, getting into regular daily newspapers nationally and regionally, rather than just the specialist press or the kind of web news that, you know, it's the people who are already converted who read the good articles, and actually we need to get it out into the mainstream. So yeah, politicians and media.
And if I might just add about working with businesses, the experience of working with the Coalition for Energy Savings has been very instructive on that front, because there is a different kind of culture in the way NGOs work and the way business associations work. But actually, I think most people that are involved would agree that we've all learned quite a lot from each other. You know, I would argue that businesses have started to get a bit bolder about speaking out and so on, from being exposed to green light for wearing, flag-waving NGOs on a regular basis.
I have no idea who you're talking about.
Okay.
I'm Carl Blumstein from the University of California, the California Institute for Energy and Environment. I don't think it's a clear-cut case that relative targets are irrelevant. I think that the issue is you need to make that target faster than the rate of growth of GDP, and then you do get absolute reductions. And I think that that's technically feasible. So I think that you can frame the problem in terms of faster than the GDP.
Peter Hennicke, Wuppertal Institute. My question is relatively easy or short. Are we really prepared for an absolute reduction of energy? In Germany, we have a target, an indicative target of the government reducing primary energy by 50% up to 2050. And all scenarios support this target. But nobody knows up to now how the institutional setting must be to reach that target, to reduce rebound effects, who's really responsible to go stepwise to an absolute reduction, who is coordinating the process. It's not the government, it's not the parliament, it's not the ministries. I will ask you, don't we need new institutions like energy efficiency agencies on a national level and on the local level in all member states? And maybe a fund for pre-financing the process and for barrier removal. I think we have to look much more carefully into the institutional setting.
Robert Van Buskirk, Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. I just want to mention the targets that are being used in the U.S. So in the State of the Union address, the U.S. President Obama mentioned that the U.S. is going to go for a doubling of building sector energy productivity by 2030. What that translates to is an efficiency improvement rate of about 3.5% per year. The way that's translated through the institutions of the U.S. government is the Department of Energy has a budget of about $200 million per year to invest in a portfolio of programs to try to accelerate the energy efficiency improvement rates. The utilities within the U.S. have spending for energy efficiency programs, which runs at about $7 to $9 billion per year, which goes to performance-based energy efficiency improvement. And those are the targets being pursued in the U.S. And I hope that's useful information.
Hi, I'm Charlotte Jensen from Aalborg University in Copenhagen. Thank you for your presentations. I just have a small question for all of you. A few of you mentioned behavioral aspects and or final consumption as a challenge. Could you elaborate on what you mean by it and then maybe suggest how to approach it?
Good evening, Didier Bosbeuf from ADEME, the French Agency for Environment and Energy Management. It's a question for the target setting issue. There are differences in the rhythm of achievement of energy efficiency right now in Europe, from 4% per year in Poland to near zero in Italy, Spain. So there are huge differences in real energy efficiency achievement. Do you think we can have a binding target in absolute value without a burden sharing or opportunity sharing? This is the first question. Second, it's a remark. There are huge differences in potential assessment. We see that NGOs propose 35% of potential assessment or academics, and the Commission proposed 20%. And of course, the level of target or the level of ambition is linked to the level of potential. So how we can reconciliate this different assessment of potential? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Arthur Neslin, you're active. I remember in 2008, 2009, when the economic crisis began, there was a lot of talk then about how we needed to have a new Green Deal which could transform the economy and towards a low-carbon energy economy, and at the same time deal with the economic crisis by creating hundreds of thousands of jobs by, for example, refurbishing homes across Europe in energy-efficient ways. That seemed to go pretty much by default in the last few years. There's been a sort of trench warfare over every single item which has been proposed to increase energy efficiency measures. If we're talking about rethinking a new start, finding a new way to advance a growth and jobs agenda for energy efficiency, should we be considering going back to the original premise of how we actually form an alliance with a large enough and powerful enough coalition, not necessarily at political level to begin with, to begin to put the issues on the agenda in a way which would bring in the most amount of people?
Just would like to mention in relation to the behavioral aspects, this is something which is already covered also in the Energy Efficiency Directive as regards, for example, smart meters or meters in general, the information that the consumers can get on the energy they consume. You know that, smart meters was already in the internal market energy package, and the ED reinforces this issue. But by, let's say, giving consumers the possibility to know what kind of energy consumption they have, then they can adapt their behaviors and take decisions that will reduce their consumption of energy, and therefore they can become more energy efficient and save money. So that is one option. The other one, still in the Energy Efficiency Directive, which I mentioned briefly in my presentation, is in relation to demand response, which is a completely new, let's say, instrument in the EU energy policy, and that will also make, let's say, a more active participation within the energy system, and therefore that should also, let's say, increase, let's say, the importance of behaviors in the general energy consumption. That is, the others were comments, so I don't have anything else to add. Thanks.
I'll pick up on three things. First of all, the idea that if you have relative energy efficiency, which is better than the increase in GDP, you do actually have energy saving. I think that's an interesting and fair point. Secondly, do we need new institutions? I'm not sure we need new institutions to deliver absolute energy saving, but I was very interested in the comment from the US from Berkeley about how the US government is actually investing, and I think perhaps what we are beginning to realise is that governments do have to put money in order to get an awful lot of money back again. That it won't, you can't just leave it to the market and expect it to happen. There has to be, you have to spend your euro in order to get €5 back in the economy. And finally, the question of the different rates of improvement of energy efficiency in the different member states. I mean, I think that that's a prime example of where the Commission needs to go in and say, hey, to Italy or wherever, I mean, this is not on in terms of what you're doing for the economy to not be doing anything on energy efficiency. I think it should be made a very clear measure of how economically efficient a government is being.
So on the point about intensity targets, I mean, obviously you're quite right. You can get the same effect with an intensity target, but I think there are a number of advantages to having an idea in advance of what the consumption level will be, and reasonable predictions can be made of that. And advantages of knowing that include things like having an idea of how much energy infrastructure you're going to need to build. There are some really impressive figures of how much Europe's got to replace most of its energy infrastructure over the next decade or so. It's going to cost I think, a trillion euros by 2020. That can be reduced a lot if the amount of energy saving that is possible to do were to be done. So that's one argument for that. Also, that way you can better calculate what level of emissions reduction you can expect from energy efficiency and so on. So there are advantages, at least theoretically, to doing that. On the question of who should coordinate the process, well, I mean, it's always fun to design new institutions and so on. I think the point is there is an awful lot that needs to be done at once, and part of the problem is that often policy solutions have not tackled the whole issue together, which is why we haven't seen the results that have been needed. If, for example, you want to get all of the building stock in a particular area renovated, then you need to make sure that you've got the information that's available to consumers. You need to make sure you've got incentives that are tailored to the requirements of the people in that area. You need to make sure that the workforce is trained and available, that there's labour schemes and so on. So there's a great many things to do which may not be the same in all parts of the country. And I guess I'm hopeful that some of the measures in the Energy Efficiency Directive, like the requirement for the building roadmaps and the financing facilities, which can bring different streams of funding together and then perhaps match those up with different projects and leverage private finance in the process. These are things that sound very complicated when you say them, but there's a need to first have political focus, which is what a target can provide, and then based on that, people really put their heads together and think, well, what do we need to make this happen? And so it might look very different in different countries, what would be the best way to organise these things, but I hope that some more enlightened thought might be applied to the question as a result of the European directives. And I guess that also links to the question about the Green Deal, really. I think there is a need for a bit more of a mobilisation, and I think to match up the public funds to stimulate private finance and have a lot of different actors involved in this. And finally, on behaviour, I mean, I think that in order to get behaviour change happening, for a start, it just needs to become easier for people to do the right thing. I think, and that's what many of the measures in place are supposed to do. The eco-design measures that mean that at a certain point it's not possible to buy a really inefficient fridge anymore. But I think also, energy efficiency needs to be brought to people more rather than them having to go out and find it. And finally, just one comment on that is I was involved with a competition called U4Energy, which was a schools competition where school kids were required to come up with energy efficiency projects. And it was actually one of the most fun bits that I've ever encountered since I've been working on energy efficiency, because the imagination and the enthusiasm that these kids came up with was just brilliant. And I suppose if it can really get into their mindset from a young age that the way you do things is efficiently, then that will help.
Imaginary course, obligatory courses for energy efficiency in schools. It would make a change from mathematics. my first point about a relative target versus an absolute target, it makes planning very difficult. That's the point Erica has made, but you cannot plan several decades in advance if you're working on the basis of something that could change every year. For example, if you look at the difference between a projection-based target and an absolute target compared to a starting year, you immediately see the difference between something that's very complex and something that's very straightforward. For 2020, the Commission worked on the basis of a projection. It then took 20% off that. The result was years of debate about whether the projection was the right one or whether it should be updated and the target adjusted based on that. For 2050, for the roadmap 2050, the Commission this time around is working on the basis of a fixed starting year, which is 2005, which makes a lot of sense because that's when EU energy consumption was at its peak. So I think that the simpler you can make it, the better it will then be for measurement and verification afterwards. To illustrate that, to give a figure on energy infrastructure, due to the uncertainty of the 2020 target, given that it was not binding or anything, the Commission's infrastructural work was done on the basis of a primes model for an increase in energy consumption between where we are now and where they thought we would be in 2020. The obvious risk was that there would be a massive overbuild of infrastructure. And when you know how much that is, and when you know that the cost of that would be passed on to consumers' bills, you get to the conclusion that as much predictability as possible is the way to go. I think another point which I would like to make, do NGOs support a 35% reduction, and how big is the difference between that and the Commission's? We are looking very seriously into the 50% reduction number that the Fraunhofer Research Institute in Germany has suggested is possible. We do believe that this level of change, which is a huge level of change, is vital if we're going to meet climate objectives, but also competitiveness and also energy security objectives. This is a stretch, of course. We're talking about a massive change, which I think that many policymakers, many NGO people have difficulty in conceiving. But there is quite a nice counterexample which I could give. I say counterexample because I'm glad there's nobody from Friends of the Earth here in the room. But if you look at the growth of nuclear in France between a space of 10 years following the first oil shock in the 1970s, the share of nuclear went from under 10% to over 70%. 10 to 70% in a 10-year period. Now, I put it to you that nuclear technology is slightly more complex than energy efficiency or renewables. I don't think there can be any comparison between the two. If we can do it for something as complex and as risky and as dangerous and as unpredictable as nuclear, surely we can do something similar for energy efficiency as well. And therefore, surely going from where we are now to even a 50% reduction in 2030 is actually much less ambitious than what has been done in the past with a far more complex technology.
Okay, I think we are running out of time, and I want to thank Claudia, Fiona, Brook, and Enrica for the presentations here. I think it was very interesting, and I will thank you.